Welcome, everyone, to another edition of 45 Forward, where our mission is to help our listeners from Los Angeles to Long Island make your second half of life even better than the first. Now, in today's episode, I'm celebrating my one-year anniversary in launching the show last January, and I've decided to do my show, just you and me, my listeners, and review the highlights of this year, the lessons I've learned, sharing some of my hopes for engaging shows in the future, and basically just talking with you about what this year has been like and what a year it has been. Now, before I talk about the show in general, I just wanted to spend a few minutes honoring the legacy of Martin Luther King, since today, of course, is MLK Day. And I'm sure you've actually been to programs, or many of you been to programs yesterday and today, as I have, honoring Dr. King. And I was thinking about, his legacy and just what lessons I learned. Not only about just his contributions to racial and social justice and economic justice, but what really struck me about him, for me personally too, is just the amazing amount of effort that he put through over the years, the perseverance, the work, the hard work, the sacrifice, the discomfort, and the risk. I was reading over an excerpt from one of his letters, the one he wrote, his famous letter from jail in 1963. What struck me was, his feeling of just real discomfort that he had to write this letter to explain himself, to explain his approach to nonviolent protest, but that protest he must. And even, in the face of criticism from a lot of people who supported him but didn't want to speak up. But speak up, he said, you must. That the issue was silence, and silence was not acceptable. But it was at great risk, as we know. But I appreciate that all the things he had to do to accomplish what he did, and the tremendous amount of work and persistence it took over the course of his lifetime. And I was thinking about that in terms of, the subjects I talk about, which is, aging over the course of life and what that takes. And, one of the sayings, everyone knows is, the Betty Davis saying, aging ain't for sissies, And as I think about that, it's like, well, it's not for old age, but it's not for young age or middle age either. It's essentially because the point is really that change ain't for sissies. That's the difficulty in life, is confronting change and adapting to change all the way through our lives, because that is the condition of life. And I think that, in order to accomplish what we do, I also think of it just I used to have next to my desk, this was actually just a label on a tea bag, and it just said, the oyster caused the pearl caused the oyster great pain. And I I try to remember that, when I go through difficulties, that this is part of life. So let me just now shift to the show and talk about change in a broader sense. And first go back to a little bit of the premise of the show and just talk with that about you, about that with you. And as you know, my basic premise came out of my work with the Act Two section at Newsday, in which I basically edited a section that was about, helping people 50 plus through the second half of life. And my sense was that we were living longer and healthier lives and more dynamic lives, more active lives. But once we reached that 50-yard line, there was really no roadmap. Life before that was pretty structured. But after that, we had a lot of years that were hopefully very productive, but we had no particular roadmap. So my goal was to provide guidance for people, not prescriptions, but guidance, advice, examples of exemplary lives over the course of a lifetime, to help people, live this life in the fullest way. So one of the first things I learned about, or I considered over the course of this time, and explored in many ways, is what does it mean to be old or older? And that, of course, is a difficult thing for us baby boomers, because of course we don't think we're old. We're not seniors. Um, we struggle with, what's the word, what's the acceptable word, and we go through these, machinations of, you know, um, 50 is the new 40, 60 is the new 50. Once you start hitting 60 and 70, things start to get real. And it's like, okay, now we're paying attention to these numbers and whether this is true or not in terms of the feeling of you're younger than your chronological age of the previous generations. It is an issue that we really need to think about. And I just think about it in terms of just being, it's not, you're just older at every stage of life. People say, what's the word we use? I just say older Americans, older Americans. There's the young olders, there's the oldest old, um, those 85 plus. And I think that, one of my colleagues, uh, Ken Taub, who I had on the show earlier this year, he and I were trying to grappling with, what do we call this term of active older people? And we came up with the olders, the young olders. And certainly that's fine. But I think the real issue is to accept the fact that aging is part of life. And it's not as if we're young and then we're old. You know, Life proceeds through various chapters, and it's the goal is to really think about how to progress through these chapters. And they're not strictly chronological. They overlap in many ways between young and old, and you go back and forth in your mind. And it's an interesting phenomenon. I was the other day, I was thinking about um, an old friend of mine who unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago. Um, One of my friends, I have several friends by the name of Jim. This is California Jim, and he was a good close friend. And years ago in the 70s, I visited with him, and he and I just took a day and we went to a spa. And at the spa, there was an interesting routine of hot and cold baths. Now, I know that hot baths are supposed to be salutary, and there's been a lot of uh, discussion about both hot and cold baths being especially good for your circulation, for your health, and so forth. And this has become sort of a phenomenon. So this was a long time ago, but we went in. It was a hot bath, and then right next to it, you went into a cold, very cold bath. And I remember doing this, and he said to me, "Well, now let's watch this. What's going to happen after a while? You're not going to know which is which. You're really not. You're not going to know if you're in cold water and hot water." And I was like, "Well, I don't think that's going to happen." Well, in fact, it did happen. It was an interesting phenomenon that I really couldn't tell it was hot or cold. And to me, that was a fun, kind of an interesting metaphor for a lot of the way I felt about life, where you go forward chronologically, but sometimes you're back in time. Your mind takes you back there. So aging, it goes back and forth between hot and cold, and between present and past and future. And sometimes you can't tell the difference. Your brain basically, you know, amalgamates all this into the experience of your life. So, I think about, aging that way, not to think about it in terms of, year by year chronology, but a way of your life proceeding back and forth. Um, Surely you're getting older, but in many ways, you feel the experiences of your younger years, and even your younger years, you anticipate your older years. So I think that's the way I think about aging. That's what I've kind of learned in this process, that um, that aging is a complex process of going back and forth in time. So next thing I thought about, and one of the things that I've covered a lot over the course of the year, um, is the whole issue of retirement. Um, I actually have, if you go to my Roel Resources website, you can take what I call my retirementality quiz. And it's not, the thing is also that, retirement has changed because we have this chunk of life. we don't think about just, okay, I'm going to work for a company for 30 years and retire. Nothing wrong with that. Some people still do that. And, but how do we want to live retirement after that? And so you need to think about things. The thing that people refer to most often are financial planning, estate planning, which is certainly part of it. But that's only part of it. So if you look at my retirement mentality quiz, if you go on roelresources.com and click on the retirement mentality quiz. So they're basically, I list 25 steps for you to look at, just to sort of, it's a checklist. Have you looked at these things? And there are 5 different categories: financial and legal planning, health and exercise, home and community, social and cognitive engagement. And what is this about? It's basically recognizing that in order to plan these parts of your life, you need to think about all these in conjunction with each other. There are a basket of issues that you need to balance, and different aspects of it require different attention. And for each person, you may value certain things more than others. But there are things for you to think about, so you don't really miss them, and you can have a more holistic way to plan your later years. Whatever that retirement means to you. So part of retirement is planning. So there is planning, there is preparation. But another one of my aphorisms I found over talking with a lot of people over the course of the year was, plan but don't predict, or prepare but don't predict. So I've had good shows with elder law attorneys like Ron Fatula and Brian Tully, with a Medicare and Social Security expert, Mark Miller. And you can find all these if you go to my 45 Forward show page on voiceamerica.com, and you can click the archive section, the episode directory on the right, and you can find any of these shows. They're all podcasts, and you can find them on my Roel Resources website as well. But basically, what I found is why I have this aphorism is that I've learned that we plan the best we can, but we can't really predict. And we are really not very good prognosticators of the future. What I often think about is the fact that we're good at predicting the past. In other words, we can predict the future based upon what's happened, what things that have happened in the past that are similar to what we expect. But there's so many things that come up that we can't, plan for, we don't know about. So many interventions in life, so many technological advancements and more advances in health or personal circumstances that change unexpectedly, that we really can't, our capacity to predict is really is really minimal. So relax, plan the best you can, and then don't worry about the issue of things that need to change. One of the ways that I like to think about planning, and I've told this story before, and it's about a story with my older brother Larry, who it's called what I call it the swimming to the raft. And this is a story about one summer when he and I were at a beach, and there was a raft out in the water, and he looked at me and he said, "I think we could swim underwater to that raft." And I said, maybe. So I took a shot at it, and I swam and swam and swam, and I came up about 5 or 6 feet short. And then he did it, and he made it. And I said, "Well, how did you do that?" He said, "Well, I just sort of figured out how many how many strokes it would take to get there." And so I did that, and that's I measured. I say it was 25 strokes, and but by able to measure it, he was able to make it. So I said, "Well, that's interesting." So you have to have a plan to get someplace. And one of the things, though, that I learned recently after recounting the story to him, and he sort of smiled and said, "You know, that happened," and he added an interesting dimension to the story, which is that the way he learned to do this was that he, like I, in high school, played water polo in gym, and we could swim okay, but you were basically victimized by the really uh, good swimmers and water polo players, and they would dunk you, and it was very uncomfortable. And so my brother Larry decided that he didn't, he knew that he could last underwater, but he didn't know how long he could last. So he started timing himself, um, and he figured out how much time he could spend underwater, and that relieved the fear and the anxiety over being underwater. And he used that um, experience to then start calculating how far he could swim underwater in the pool. So that's how he learned how to do this. And so it was really instructive for me to learn that a lot of things in life, the positive lessons like planning, come from adversity. And adversity is a good teacher and a useful teacher, and that's how we make take every lesson to move forward. So we're I'm going to talk about one more aspect of planning, but we're going to, and then I'm going to talk about a number of other things, basically focusing after the first break. We're going to be talking with the first guest of my show, my first show last year, Kathleen Adi. So that should be, I'm looking forward to talking with Kathleen again. Folks, I don't want you to go away. I have much more to talk about, you and me, with Kathleen in the next segment. So come back after the break and we'll continue with 45 Forward, my first anniversary show. Welcome back, folks, to 45 Forward. We're on the line now with Kathleen Adi, the guest from my very first show last year. So I brought her back for an encore performance with me, and I'm just delighted to have her. So Kathleen, welcome to the show.
Oh, Ron, thank you so much. It was such an honor to be your first guest, and I'm so proud to be here 12 months later so we can celebrate all over again. Thank you for having me.
You're quite welcome. And so Kathleen has served in many capacities in federal and state governments, and developing lots of programs and managing programs to support seniors. So in our first show, we talked a lot about the importance of connection, especially connection to community. And so this was a year ago. The pandemic was in a different stage. I don't even know what stage we're in now, where it's a complicated pandemic, and so I just wanted to ask you, Kathleen, where do you think we are in terms of dealing with issues of social isolation and connection these days? Have we made some progress?
Ron, I think we actually have made progress. And probably, as you made mention in your last segment, one of the things is we learn from adversity. And this particular pandemic has really taught us so much. But so many of our older adults, people who enjoy interacting with others and go to senior centers or have various needs, such as the need for a hot meal delivered to their home. I think, again, we've really learned as the aging network to be able to deliver those services to people. But I think people also celebrate the fact that there's great people out there that are volunteering to make this happen. And in the last 12 months, that's what we've seen, a huge volunteer effort to really serve older adults, especially those who are vulnerable or perhaps even homebound. But, today, of course, is Martin Luther King Day, and we celebrate service. And I think what has continued through the last 12 months is really that commitment from volunteers to make sure that people stay active in their community and they give of themselves to be of service. So we've made a lot of progress, but of course the challenge is the continuing of it and how long this will continue. Who knows? We're still kind of in that cycle right now of still wearing our masks, Many of the centers are limiting the number of people who are attending. Some have not even opened or have closed, but there's lessons learned all the way around. And again, I just think that commitment to community has been witnessed in the last 12 months. And as challenging as it is to keep going on in this way, I think we can do it.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that so there are a couple of things that underlined in my mind, which is just that for better or worse. I mean, hopefully for better, the pandemic, which really drove us into social isolation, has really exemplified how important connections are. And it's been sad, especially with seniors in nursing homes and other kinds of adult facilities, that people weren't able to see them, and there were lots of missteps, and there are lots of things that need to be correct. But I think it really did emphasize, how we are connected as a society and the importance of doing so on multiple generations. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And I think, again, one of those things when we look back and say, wow, we've really come a long way. I know our technology has changed and continues to change, of course, in every year.
Mm-hmm.
But we have so many more older adults that really utilize technology to be able to stay in touch with people and family members. Before the pandemic, there probably weren't a lot of people that stayed connected to their grandchildren or their loved ones, using FaceTime and so forth. But now it's commonplace. And, I think, again, we get so comfortable with the status quo, we forget how far we have come. But even some of the senior centers in their programming, they have really learned how to do Zoom, and they can have breakout sessions and, do different trainings for people, and older adults can go with it. They know and understand how to use the technology. So I think that has helped immensely. And again, here we are a year later from when you and I spoke. And again, I think our older adults, people 55 plus, or in this instance, maybe 45 and going forward, I think, again, people feel much more comfortable, recognizing that the commitment to community is important, and to really challenge themselves to take part whenever they can.
Yeah. We had a wonderful experience in my family in December 22nd was my aunt's 100th birthday. And, she's living in Westchester at a continuing care community with one of her daughters. And we had a screen of family members from everywhere. One of her sons was in Edinburgh, in Scotland. Others spread around this country. I'm here on Long Island, of course. I had a brother in South Carolina, a cousin in New Jersey, people on the West Coast. And so I think that, there really has been, real value to technology, even though I think there are many instances where we say we're zoomed out. Yeah, I get that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But the flip side is that we have the opportunity to do this. And the other thing is that that people are recognizing that when people need help, as you mentioned, there are people to help. So one of my guests early in the year was a woman named Wendy Weiss, who runs a company called TechDime, and she used to be on Wall Street, and then she changed careers and realized that there was a real need to teach people, especially older folks, how to use technology, and that's what she does.
Absolutely. And I think that's important, because one of the things that when we take a look back and see how far we've come, we've found mentors. And mentors don't have to be a certain age. They can be anyone that you rely upon and you respect to kind of help train and teach. And I think it's applicable to technology, talking about how mentors can help us learn and challenge ourselves to stay current. But I think, as you were speaking, as we spoke a year ago, and then certainly in your last segment, about how keeping things fresh and staying engaged with community, being very proactive in things that you know that you need to do, and really recognizing mentors who, throughout this pandemic, have really encouraged us to go forward. And I guess what I'm reminded of again today, because it's the 17th of January, is Betty White, and how I feel she gave the faith case of older adults, people in the old category of close to 100, how she really inspired people to keep that spirit within them so that they're giving back to their families, that they're encouraging themselves and challenging themselves to reach new goals and take part in things that they haven't done, and then to enjoy life, to plan, but to enjoy life to the fullest extent. So all of these mentors that we found and people that we want to emulate as we grow older, because as I think I shared with you in our former segment that we're all seniors in training. And one of the things that we need to do is to really recognize those wonderful things that others do that might inspire us to be the best we can be.
Correct. I totally agree. One of the other things that we talked about a lot was just this notion of what community is. And I think that this is, an evolving thing. And I think that one of the things, one of the stories I remember you told was about your grandmother preparing 2 meals for people in her community. So she was, you grew up in Kansas, and this was a small place in Kansas. And I think that's, so the recognition, as you were saying before about volunteers, I think is important, but that our community, I look at the community of support that we can put together really, I look at it sort of as a 3-legged stool. I mean, there are government services, official government services. There are nonprofit services, and there are private services, business, services, and community services that are part of, nonprofit and other, organizations. And I think that all of these things are really necessary to support us all as we get older. And I think, so they all make up part of the community, but I think that, we're sort of struggling with, I think right now deciding what function the government plays in our community. But I think we're fighting ourselves sometimes, just recognizing it has a role. It's not the entire role, but this is what makes up the total support system. And how do we manage that? How do we coordinate it and work together on this?
I totally agree. And I think part of that is sharing information. And when you are operating in a community, and again, the community could be your neighborhood, it could be your community at large, it could be resources in the community. And as you made mention, it could be government, nonprofits, and private sector as well. But being able to share information, and I'll kind of go into a little bit of that. I think one of the things that we know, and you referenced nursing facilities, is our ombudsman program that take part in nursing facilities. They too are a valuable partner to help and receive support for people who are in nursing facilities. They are there as an advocate for the residents there. And many of these ombudsmen are volunteers. So that's just, again, it's a government program initiated under the Older Americans Act. They exist in nursing facilities, and they're there to serve as an advocate for residents, but they really do ensure that particular resident's sense of community is aware of their needs, and they actually fight on their behalf to make things as normal as possible in the life of a nursing home resident. So that's a great example of how government can work together with the private sector and nonprofit sector on behalf of a resident or of an older person. And I just agree with you so much that, taking all of these resources together and sharing where people can get information is just so critical and vital, because while one service may not totally serve someone, it might be a part of what someone needs. And I think, again, if our communities, and again, our communities at large, our neighborhoods, our cities and towns, and even our states, if we don't share information, and that includes some of the challenges as well as some of the very successful objectives, we really don't grow. And I think that's where we get value, especially during a pandemic. We grow from adverse conditions, and we celebrate those success of what community can do when faced with such critical challenges.
Yeah, one of the things I think I remember you mentioning was just, your approach I liked a lot, which was about, offering resources, but promoting a person-centered approach, basically
That's
giving
right.
people, an active say in how to age and in what ways to age.
Right.
And I think this is sort of our our complicated American DNA of balancing freedom with fairness and equal opportunity and justice. And I think that there are ways to do this, and I think that, so to recognize the role of government, but also recognize that the flexibility that other resources, including what you've just said, communities, stepping up and volunteering, when you need to do that. I mean, you can't,
That's right.
there are just circumstances that are extraordinary, and people, need to find those resources. And sometimes, one of the organizations I've had on is the National Aging in Place Council.
Yeah.
I've had local members involved, and I've had the national leadership involved. And these are experts that deal with helping people age in place. It's a very interesting
That's
network
right.
of folks there. And, so that it's, as you point out, being able to bring resources to people, in a timely manner when they need it. That's the challenge for us, I think.
I think it totally is. And you referenced that. I do remember going with my grandmother to make sure that her two elderly neighbors received their meals. And again, with many more women in the workplace these days, some of that can be challenging, but it can be done. And it is done each and every day. And again, I just think it's so valuable because aging in place is where people want to be. And as I believe I probably mentioned in the previous broadcast, certainly nursing facilities can become a community as well. But for most people, they want to remain in their homes. And it's great to have the services, the people, the volunteers, and that friendly face to really make everything come together so people can live where they want to, and their dignity is preserved. And I think that's so vital as we grow older.
Yeah, I think so. Obviously there are nursing facilities. There are also assisted living facilities of all sorts
That's
of
right.
types and other adult homes. These are also communities. And I think the issue is how do you give people information so they can make choices with their families? And I
That's
think
right.
that's one of the things, can you stir that conversation? And I guess the last thing I wanted to do with our our segment went quickly, Kathleen, but
Yes, it
in the
is.
couple of minutes we have left, it just underlined, the interdependence we have between different segments of our population and our generations. And I think that that's something that we're also coming to realize. You've in terms of the programs you support, you often deal with multiple generations in these programs, and I think that's really a key is understanding that there is freedom of choice, there's individuality, but that we are inherently interdependent on each other, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely right. And again, I appreciate you even bringing that forward because I think, again, that's so very, very important. And it does circle right back to being a good mentor, looking at people who are demonstrating and living that active lifestyle, going forward and enjoying life and really making the second half of their life so much stronger. That's really what we have to focus on. And our generations can help us get there, but we need to share and we need to be open and we need to understand how important it is for us to have interdependence and dependence as we grow older with support when necessary.
Right, right. Yeah, and I think we're, you know, support when necessary, and also recognizing that there is a tremendous contribution for people who are older. Yes, many of
Absolutely.
us are
The
healthier.
value.
Yeah, that there's
You're
the
absolutely right.
the value as we get older in terms of knowledge, experience, and support. And not to mention that, as a lot of us aren't retiring, there's a financial contribution that we continue to provide society, not just, we're givers, not just takers. So I think that's
That's
important to
exactly
recognize.
right.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, and I think so much of the news has been showing and demonstrating that of late, which makes me very proud because older Americans give back not only of their time, but as you said, economically as well as, with their wisdom and education that they have to share. So it's really very beneficial to be able to grow old and to appreciate growing older as well amongst the generations.
Right, right. Well, our segment has just whizzed by, Kathleen. So I'm going to have you back for another show, soon. But I really
I
appreciate you
would be
coming back. I was honored that you and grateful that you had the time to squeeze in today for at least one segment of our show. And I wish you all the best. I thank you for your continued wisdom. I wish you a good rest of the day.
Well, thank you, Ron, and congratulations on your 1-year anniversary to 45 Forward and also Voice America. We're really, really glad to take part, and I wish you well.
Well, thanks very much. Okay, folks. Well, I've just finished with Kathleen. I'm going to let her go and get on with her day, but don't go away for yourselves. We have one more segment to go, and I've got lots more to say for on your behalf. So don't go away. I'll be right back. Welcome back, folks, to my 1-year anniversary show. I've been talking about the various lessons I've learned, the many fascinating people I've met on the show. We just finished a segment, a call in from Kathleen Adi, who was the guest of my first show last year. So I was really gratified to have her back and to reconnect with her. In this segment, I wanted to talk about a few other things that really I've thought a lot about this year and learned a lot from my guests. One of them has to be how do we deal with change and obstacles in our life, hardships. And my guest last week, John Leland, was a great guest. He's the author of Happiness is a Choice You Make, which is based on, he's a New York Times reporter, is based upon his spending a year with 6 people over the age of 85 and learning what it was their lives were like and how they dealt with things. So a lot of them, as you might expect, were dealing with lots of hardships and obstacles. And, so it gave me a lot of thoughts about, well, how do we deal with obstacles? And of course, one of the ways is to change your expectations. And sort of the two phrases that I compared are dealing with things in spite of versus if only. So the notion that obstacles and hardships are just part of life, and you can be happy and satisfied and fulfilled along with these obstacles and hardships. Not to say, well, I would be happy or feel better if only these things weren't there. Well, they will be there. Some things will always be there. So, to accept them as, that you can live next to these issues and be gratified and satisfied with life, just dealing with them. One of my other thoughts was about, how do you deal with this? What you adjust, adjust. I think about, one of my guests was a woman named Miyoko Chu from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. So we talked about the natural world a lot. And to me, I sometimes, when I say, well, what would nature do faced with these things? And, nature adjusts, the weather changes, birds and other animals, they adjust. So we just need to, adjust our expectations of life as to this is what life is about. And, to just find another way. Life is about constant change. And in fact, our society depends on constant change to move forward. I mean, let's face it, our consumer society, depends upon changing fashions, changing interests, changing desires. So this is part of life. And, in many ways, we just need to make adjustments and to, again, prepare but not predict. I was at because inevitably you're going to have missteps and mistakes, and that's part of life as well. I was at a meeting, a couple months ago when the guy I was sitting next to, he said, you know what, I tell my children, my grandchildren, I say, go out in life and make mistakes, make lots of mistakes. But as you move forward, make better mistakes. And I thought that was a great way of putting it because, that is how we move forward. We learn from our mistakes. And I think from my own experience, I tend to learn more from my mistakes than my successes. They tend to be having more of an emotional heft to them. And so, I think that that's important to embrace our mistakes. Another one of my favorite expressions came from a guy named Victor Khayyam. He was the chairman of this was many years ago of Remington Shavers. He's a guy who did his commercial was I like the company so much I bought it. And Khayyam's one of his favorite phrases was, even when you fall flat on your face, you're still falling forward. And I think that to me was a kind of a compact way of saying, that it's okay to fail and to move forward. So what are some of the other things I thought about doing the show? Well, a lot of it, the show was about fears. As we age, there's the natural fears of losing our health, but and I think that again, one of the things I learned in talking with John Leland, uh, his experience with older people, is that people fear loss more than they feel gain. So that there is an aversion to loss, but it's an inevitable part of life, and in many cases, um, you know, loss can be not just losing people, but losing things in your life, losing certain capabilities. But in the process of doing that, there are other opportunities open up. And I think in some ways, letting go of losses and acknowledging them, acknowledging the pain, but also, recognizing that it's freeing somewhat. And this is part of a conversation I had with um, a woman named Carol Wallman and Vicki Elmer, the two people who were involved in programs for seniors for many years. Carol ran a senior center for many years, and Vicki is a patient advocate and has done a whole bunch of things. And they were talking about, this, that in some cases, as you get older, you lose things, but you also have an opportunity to gain and basically be freed by by opportunities that you gain actually through the losses. I think that one of the fears is that Vicky mentioned to me was, and I understand this. So, as we go on in life, she mentioned a woman whose fear was being forgotten. That's what she feared, that her life would be forgotten. And I think this isn't, I think we want a life that matters. We want a life that has meaning. And, one of my other guests, Susan Caperso, who was an end of life doula, but also she's what she calls a legacy creator. And this was a very interesting, notion to me, that basically what she did with people is to find ways that, as we get older in life, and think about our legacy, is to write it down and prepare, ways that we want to be remembered, taking charge of our lives, in how we want to be remembered, not just doing estate planning, which of course is, important, doing all the advanced planning and their will and so forth is certainly part of the later part of life, but also, making a choice about how you want, what contribution do you want people to know about you? What was important to you in your life? What were the memories that you want to leave behind to your children and grandchildren? I think in many ways, those are the most interesting things that, that that are left with us, and I think that too often, and myself included, I realize there's certain points where I'm like, gee, I wish I knew my dad thought about this or my mom thought about this. And this is an opportunity as I go forward to think about this, to create a legacy of our family memories and thoughts and ideas that we want to leave behind. So that was an important idea about how to leave a legacy. I think that, another issue was brought about by a woman named Carol Marek, who she's an expert in what she calls solo aging. I think this is, another issue. So fear of being alone as we get older. I think that's, we unfortunately we lose family, and friends. They move away, they pass away, and so Carol had some very interesting ideas about, how we can adapt to this, and recognizing that it's not just older folks. That about a third of our population is aging alone. So it's not just the result of, a spouse losing a husband or wife. It's about this is part of our culture, that's real. And so she had all sorts of ways to adapt and to think about this, and to basically make a use of our resources and interdependence with other organizations and individuals. And to basically find your support again and recognize that there are ways once again to adjust. Um, I think that finally, one of the things that I really was intrigued by is learning about the lives of so many interesting people who were works in place that they just they live life fully, they continue to live life fully, and every stage of life is a different chapter. Nobody just lived a life and then retired to something else. I mean, I think of a good friend of mine, Patricia King, who was a terrific corporate consultant, who knew she wanted to be a novelist at the age of 9, and then she became one after a very successful career as a corporate consultant. She began a historical mystery writer at the age of 69, and a very successful one. Another woman, Hillary Topper, who was a terrific PR and social media expert, became a triathlete in her 50s. Lance Cheney, a friend of mine who took over his family's brush manufacturing business and found a way to blend it with his artistic passion of his youth, with creative ways to create these incredibly specialized brushes in a competitive, low-cost industry. And one of his brushes is now on the rover on Mars. And Evelyn Candell, who was one of the first women to join the Marines. Then she basically educated herself, became an art teacher, and now in her late 80s is a distinguished poet. So I think there are just extraordinary ways for us all to grow throughout life. And I just have had really an enjoyable time doing this on my show and bringing out folks and bringing out the stories of folks who've done this and can model just for me and for you in terms of what is possible in life. So we're coming into the conclusion of my show. I have lots more to say, and I will in future shows. I'm hoping very much that I will have a second anniversary in a year from now, and I have no doubt that I will. But I just wanted to mention as we close today, if you have questions or comments from me or suggestions for future shows or topics you want me to cover, you could always email me at ron.roel, ROEL, @gmail.com. You could look at not only my retirement mentality quiz, but other episodes on my website, roelresources.com, or you could reach me on Facebook and LinkedIn. And you could tell other folks if they've missed my podcast today, you can listen to it on voiceamerica.com in the episode directory, archive on the right, on the 45 Forward page. You can also find it on Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and as I said before, or you can find also episodes and also more information about my guests on my website, roelresources.com. So, folks, be sure to join me next Monday, 12 noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern Time, when I'll be talking with Daphne Adler. She's a terrific interior designer who's elevated the principles of university design and aging in place to living in place for those of us who are aging as younger olders. Until then, folks, keep moving forward, 45 forward.